What you just saw was the introductive cutscene of Little Nightmares 2, a puzzle platforming horror game released in February of 2021 by Tarsier Studios and Bandai Namco Entertainment. In this game, players play a small boy named Mono while he journeys through a dark and twisted world. He eventually encounters a little girl named Six trapped in the basement of an abandoned cabin who aids him on his journey. This game is one of the most impressive examples I've seen of a game's narrative being told explicitly through visuals, sound, and mechanics. The two children help each other through all sorts of areas and solve all kinds of environmental puzzles in order to further progress. Oftentimes, they must depend on and trust one another in order to successfully make it through the numerous trials and tribulations they face moving throughout the world, as it is clearly one that isn't meant for such small children to face alone. In Chapter 7 of his book, Once Upon a Pixel, Eddie Patterson states that a key to developing unique game stories is when storytelling features begin to augment and overlap with the experience of world building and the overarching narrative design of the game. A shining example of this concept, Little Nightmares 2 forgoes traditional storytelling in favor of environmental storytelling and world building, utilizing visuals and mechanics rather than dialogue in order to tell its story. Mono and Six's journey eventually leads them beyond the woods where we begin and across the water to the Pale City. Here, they must escape monsters and traverse the twisted environments of the ruined cityscape. Each of these environments are shown to be vastly different throughout the game, including the bullies and teachers of the school, mannequins and doctor of the hospital, and the people of the city itself. All this in hopes of finding the signal tower at the center of this distorted world. Eventually, Six is captured by a mysterious figure known as the Thin Man, who traps her inside the signal tower. Mono must then find a way to defeat the Thin Man and reach the tower, where we find a climax that still has many players screaming in anger at their screens or even crying from the betrayal of a lifetime.
You're back in your childhood classroom. It feels so familiar, yet warped, like your childhood memories dipped in a fairground mirror. And there's this tight knot in your stomach, an uneasy feeling. It feels so wrong, yet so real.
That excerpt from one of the trailers for Little Nightmares 2 encapsulates how the game is meant to make its audience feel. Many of the things in this world feel familiar, but are warped and twisted almost beyond recognition. In an interview with narrative designer Dave Mervick, he discusses the purpose of making the main characters children, stating that there's all these primal fears that kids process in a different way. That's what we say for all of the characters in Little Nightmares you encounter. There is this stretching and twisting and distorting of the characters that you see. And this is a sentiment that clearly rings true throughout the story. The hunter ripping at some fleshy object, the teacher's neck stretching and moving beyond all logical limits. The doctor crawling across the ceiling, and even the Thin Man phasing through objects. Each of these monsters draw on some form of greater fear in order to affect the player and immerse them in this world as Mono and Six experience it. Looking into how Little Nightmare 2's story is directly told through its visuals, there are constant references to critical plot points in seemingly insignificant moments of the game. The distortion of the Pale Tower and its fleshy, true form especially are something that is hinted at even from the earliest points in the game. For example, when Mono first meets Six, there's a drawing of the signal tower on the far left wall. This image of the tower appears again in the school, as well as countless eyes like the true form of the tower. Even in the dark of the hospital, there are constant images of eyes, or the tower, or even the Thin Man that hint at the source of the distortions in this world. When Mono initially meets Six, she's playing a music box in order to calm or soothe herself, and even this becomes important imagery among the numerous other images in the room, because it appears once again in the final chapter, as the very thing tying Six to her distortion in the tower, and Mono is ultimately forced to destroy it in order to save her. Mono's future identity is yet another plot point that is hinted at consistently throughout the game. Long before we have even encountered the Thin Man and his world-breaking abilities, it is made clear that Mono plays some larger role through images, just as with the tower. In the first playable moment of the game, Mono wakes up in a field in the forest, surrounded by broken TVs, dropping critical hints immediately. The Thin Man and Mono also clearly both have some kind of power over TVs seen throughout the game. Mono is able to tune the TVs to enter the distorted hallway early on in the game, and is even able to phase through them in later parts of the game. Probably my favorite visual hint in the game, though, is the objects in the background when the little girl is revealed to be Six, the main character from the first game. As she picks up her raincoat, telling players who one of the two children is, a broken TV, fedora, and suit can all be seen nearby. This alone screams Mono's future identity for anyone careful enough to pay attention. On one's first playthrough, the cutscene revealing Mono to become the Thin Man is jaw-dropping, but after that fact it's simply impressive. The betrayal of Six once she realizes Mono becomes the Thin Man, which creates the very time loop where he actually does and perpetuates the cycle, is a work of absolute genius, especially because you've grown to care so much for both characters. It feels like I'm holding my breath every time I see the scene, because I want to scream at Six to not let go, because that's why he'll become what you think he is. And the only way to ever actually end the cycle is to pick him back up. Mechanics are another aspect of Little Nightmares 2 that played a critical role in how players are able to experience and navigate the world from the perspectives of Mono and Six. Not only are mechanics used to aid the direct telling of the story, but the way that they are implemented acts as a constant reminder of the player's powerlessness. In an interview with game producer Lucas Roussel, he discusses this implementation of weapons in the game, stating, "Let's take the ability to pick up and wield a weapon. We decided to make it quite hard for the character to carry and hit. It was critical to keep this oppressive feeling from the first game. Yes, you have a companion, and yes, you can still find some weapons in the game, but you remain a small child struggling in a world not meant for kids." This design is clearly visible throughout the game. Even when you find yourself armed and able to defend yourself, it is still extremely difficult, and it's certainly not uncommon for it to take multiple tries to get past an enemy. Both the school and the hospital feature this type of mechanic most prominently, but it appears in plenty of other instances throughout the game as well. Even the items that aren't weaponry, like the flashlight, can be difficult to effectively use. In the hospital, Mono encounters an area where living mannequins attack him if there isn't some kind of light shining directly on them. This might seem like a simple mechanic at first, but once the player gets to the point where they're surrounded by mannequins on all sides, it quickly becomes less so. I personally found that the difficulty here really increased my immersion to the point that I was wildly uncomfortable the entire section. But at the same time, I have to commend the design for being able to accomplish that so effectively. Another critical element of the narrative is Six's state of being, as she is kidnapped on multiple occasions, prompting Mono to rescue her. This happens in the school with the bullies, and again later when the Thin Man takes her to the signal tower. The separation caused by this, and other factors, often caused a shift in the way that the puzzles functioned in the game. Many of the environmental puzzles throughout the story require both Six and Mono in order to progress. This plays further into the idea that this world is not meant for such small kids to be traversing, much less alone. The two have to work together constantly, otherwise they often stand no chance. Another mechanic that I find particularly interesting to look at is the hand-holding mechanic, which is introduced to players early on in the forest. This is a cool mechanic because it's completely optional and it has no bearing on the course of the narrative. Rather, it exists entirely for players to feel some sense of comfort. This mechanic, while legitimately helpful for those who feel a sense of anxiety throughout the game, can also have major drawbacks. Many of the players who frequently use this mechanic, in turn, are inherently more likely to form an emotional attachment to Six, which can serve to make the final scenes much more heart-wrenching in their playthroughs. A final mechanic used in forming the narrative of Little Nightmares 2 is the catching mechanic. On numerous occasions, the children must cross a gap that they cannot cross alone. Therefore, the player must help Six across and sprint jump to the other side, where Six will catch Mono. This mechanic is an absolute cornerstone in creating the impact in the final scenes because it trains the player to trust Six. She's never failed to catch us, and we've saved her how many times by now? Why would she fail us now? But as she grabs Mono at the end of the jump and doesn't pull him right up, when players see her make the decision, when she lets go, it absolutely breaks our understanding of the game. Players can't really blame Mono for being used by the tower in order to get revenge, nor can we blame Six for letting go, as she was tortured by the Thin Man for what she understands to be no reason. Thus, both the children are doomed to eternally repeat the cycle in a time loop. I could honestly go on for hours just looking at the masterful way the story of Little Nightmares is told through visuals, mechanics, and even audio. But sadly, this video can only strive to summarize a sliver of what I want to talk about. The intricate care with which the developers managed to weave in elements of the narrative throughout the story is nothing less than a work of art. Each decision, whether narrative or even just aesthetic, creates a cohesive and deliberate framework and tone that are undeniably impressive. I'll leave you with one final quote from the trailer as food for thought. Because when you wake, breathing hard and dripping in a cold sweat, the feeling remains. The nightmares have crossed into the real world. Every time we turn a dark corner or reach blindly under the bed, they have us wonder, is there someone, something behind me? Nightmares will affect us in ways we can't even begin to explain, and yet we may not even remember them. But they will remember you. Thank you for watching.